In probably the biggest airstrike by the Ukrainians so far against Russian targets, Ukraine strikes numerous Russian air bases, among them an airbase where the Russian strategic bomber force is stationed. On the ground, the Russians keep up the pressure and at several points are making small gains. We'll talk about this, the developments along the front line in this situation report, as well as about the situation in Avdiivka in particular, where we'll look at the current fortification, the known fortification system to come to some conclusion where the front line is probably going to have a longer period of stabilization in the future. But I said this and more in this situation report. Ukrainian President Zelensky said since the beginning of the war, the Russians have used roughly 1,000 missiles, 2,800 Shahid drones, and roughly 7,000 gliding bombs against Ukrainian targets simply since the beginning of this war. Ukraine is also, the Ukrainian spokesperson for the southern region is saying that Russia still has 9 ships and submarines in total that can use Caliber cruise missiles. There haven't been much usage of the Caliber. There hasn't been much usage of the Caliber in the recent weeks, but the Russians still have significant stockpiles and a production run, getting new ones. So the danger has not passed. Those ships can still launch Caliber cruise missiles against Ukrainian targets. Those strikes the Russians did hit in the last weeks 80% of all Ukrainians' thermal power plants. Together with the attacks against hydropower plants, more than 6 gigawatts of capacity have been lost. That doesn't necessarily mean that all those power plants are destroyed. Some of them will take partial or full production, will continue it or start it up again, probably somewhat soon, but some of them have been taken out for probably several years. They have to be completely restructured, completely rebuilt. At the same time, while the Western aid is completely insufficient, the Ukrainian defense industry needs to take up the slack as much as possible, which will obviously be hindered with a lack of electricity, as well as the problems that are coming to the Ukrainian population with a lack of electricity. In some areas, there are power outages for several days already because the electricity grid has been hit so hard by Russia. Ukraine strikes back, though. They have struck in probably the biggest air attack on Russian targets since the beginning of the war. They have struck several air bases in Kursk, which is up here. They also hit in Krasnodar, down here. They hit the Engels Air Base in Saratov, which is up here. This is where the Russian Tupolev 95 and the Tupolev 160 are being stationed. So the Russian strategic bomber force. And they also hit a Russian base in Morozovsk in Rostov-on-Don. So down here, several strikes have happened. The Russians are saying that they shot down 53 Ukrainian drones. That's what they are claiming. Kursk, and on the air bases here, we have Ukrainians claiming significant damage. They claim that 3 Tupolev 95 were hit in Engels. They say that 2 Sukhoi 25 were damaged in Yeysk, and 6 planes were destroyed in Morozovsk. The problem is, though, that we do have some imagery, and while this here shows Morozovsk being filled with plane, we are seeing 26 Sukhoi 34 on this picture here alone, visible out in the open, even closely packed at several places, and some, as you can see, some Sukhoi 30 and Sukhoi 35, while there was a full opportunity, while it was a target-rich environment. Since then, several satellite pictures have appeared and don't seem to show any significant damage. The Russians claim that they basically shot down everything, and as so far, while there are, as said, numerous Ukrainian claims about significant damage being done, so far I have not seen any proof. I rather have seen proof of the contrary, that the damage has either been negligible or that there was no damage whatsoever on the ground, but we might see more coming in the future. An interesting fact here, or a more weird fact, was what has happened here. One of the drones flying towards was not meant to be. One of the drones flying towards the Russian side, flying towards a Russian target, was actually equipped with a loudspeaker, at least according to this, and they were playing the melody of a German drinking song.
Дрон с музыкой. Видели когда-то такое?
It's was sollen wir trinken? Basically, what are we supposed to drink? That was played here from a drone flying there. I'm kind of disappointed, to be honest, that we haven't heard Ride of the Valkyries from Richard Wagner. That would be more appropriate in my mind. But while that is kind of funny that they did it, as said, the proof that they hit something and destroyed something so far is still lacking. At the same time, there is report of an explosion in a pipeline, in an oil pipeline, close to in the Rostov region. The Ukrainian intelligence agencies claim responsibility for that, so that might have been another successful strike against the Russian oil infrastructure. Let's switch to the developments along the front line. I cannot record any change north of the Seversky Donetsk. There are some Russian claims that they have come closer towards Cherny, but no proof whatsoever, and other Russian mill bloggers are denying that, so the front line seems to be more or less stable. If we go south of the Seversky Donetsk, we do have some changes. First of all, we have an image here showing that the Russians gained something close to Vesele, roughly here and here some area, and this is from a pro-Ukrainian mill blogger showing that they managed to push over, to push out a fairly significant distance. This was the other one, this was here, and on the map it should be roughly here and here. So they managed to advance a significant distance, or at least significant distance in the current context. Whether they managed to capture the positions there is still a different question, though, as those videos show strikes on them. But we see Russian activity, and Russian activity that at least shows some temporary progress here. On Chasiv Yar, the Russians made a mechanized attack with a significant size. The Ukrainians are saying 32 armored vehicles were used, MBTs as well as IFVs, and they claim 19 of them being destroyed. I have not seen necessary proof of the especially the volume of these destructions. The Russians, even according to the Ukrainians, have had some success with these attacks, though. Lately, the last positions that were held by the Russians were here. And now they managed to advance several hundred meters along the main road to the outskirts, to the outermost houses of Chasiv Yar. The Russians themselves are claiming they gained a foothold in the first houses and house-to-house fighting has started. I have not seen visual proof of this, but we do see that while this mechanized attack has been very costly to them, it showed them some success at the same time. Now, with the battle for Chasiv Yar about to start, we can look at the map, the topographic map, which shows us here Chasiv Yar. This is Ivanivske and this is Bodanivka down here, which while a look on the map shows that they are basically advancing without flank cover, and this will probably force them to push the flanks in the north as well as in the south forward. At the same time, they are advancing on the ridgeline here, which should allow them a much easier advance towards the and a much easier success. Would guarantee them easier success inside of Ivanivska and Bodanivka, as they are now advancing along the ridgeline here. And as you can see, we are talking about a sizable difference in height. That was 70 meters roughly, I think, and here 220 down to 138. So what is that? Over 80 meters. Showing us that the altitude advantage here is significant and will make it easier for the Russians to secure their flanks, as this time they have not advanced in the valley but on the ridgeline by advancing towards Chasiv Yar. Further south at Avdiivka we have changes too. Now there have been fresh geolocalizations inside of Berdichi, but those are all east of the river here. So what we've talked about in the last situation report, the grad shelling of this position was, despite Ukrainians claiming them shelling a Russian position, was very likely Russians shelling a Ukrainian position. Since then, not a shred of evidence has appeared showing that the Russians have already advanced to here. Everything since then is east of the river, so it seems likely that the Russians are still bogged down east of the river here on this side. In Semenivka, though, they have gained additional ground. We have a fresh geolocalization up here, and this is a few houses further north. I think last time it has been roughly here, but then again, we see this is, if I'm right, then this has been 4 or 5 houses further north. Not a big deal, but at the same time, obviously, an advance into Semenivka, which increases the pressure on the Ukrainians here. At the same time, the Russians also managed to now fortify their positions in the direction of Umanske, where lately in the last situation report we had some geolocalizations of them operating here, but now we know that they actually managed to gain a foothold, and they keep up the pressure here at Vodiane and Pervomaiske at the same time, despite Ukrainian counterattacks being reported as well. Further south in Novomykhailivka, the Russians also have some successes. We have 2 geolocalizations. One is roughly here and one is here. I can show it to you real quick. We have it up here. Those should be the Dachas area, and you see it's roughly in the middle, a little bit right to the middle. So they have reached positions inside of this here. And we have them right at the road next to the water here, down here as well. So this should probably, the right front line is probably about this here by now. At the same time, they're also advancing in the south. They have been spotted here now, so they're keeping up the pressure in the south on the rest of Novomykhailivka, still under Ukrainian control. Spotted here, obviously that will make the situation worse for the Ukrainians in their defense of Novomykhailivka. South of Velika Novosilka, the Ukrainians did a counterattack at Staromayorske and regained positions. They advanced by 830 meters and 1.5 kilometers in width, advancing here along that tree line further to the west, and thus taking away pressure on Staromayorske that was building up with the Russian advance here. This is a ridge line as well, so if the Russians reach that point, then both Uroshaine as well as Staromayorske are in serious danger here. Thus here the Ukrainian counterattack has improved their position at this time. The Russians also did some attacks at Priutne. It's unclear how far their successes have been. I have not found conclusive evidence. It's possible that they gained some additional ground, but definitely not much, and not much to talk, not much to prove, not much to show for. Maybe a few positions, but no overall change that is of any significance. In south of Orikhiv, we have the Russians advancing and attacking here through those positions line towards the north. They managed to advance somewhat forward, but were probably pushed back. So the pressure upon Robotine is increasing again. But as of now, the Ukrainians still hold all of it, or almost all of it, of the town. But the fighting will probably continue there as well. If we go further west along the Dnipro, there's fighting also being reported. Fresh attacks on Krinky. No change in territory that I can record though. So let's go back directly to the situation, to the operational situation at Avdiivka. Here, the Russians keep advancing towards the west. If you remember the situation after Avdiivka fell, when the Russians were advancing towards here, I explained to you that we are having some fallback positions here, I think is the English word, basically positions that are meant to block the Russians from advancing further. The most likely first better line of the Ukrainians, the line where the Ukrainians want to stop them, is here between Berdychi, Semenivka and Orlivka, using the water here, obviously, but this was only to gain time. As the Ukrainian side has failed to prepare for a bigger Russian attack, as they had failed to build up fortifications in the rear, which they admit by now, but that would be the reasons for which would be a discussion for another video probably. While they had failed to pre-build them, the Russian successes in Avdiivka made it impossible to fortify them properly. Everything outside of Spades and outside of pike access from Ukrainian soldiers was basically no longer usable. If a direct visibility from the Russian front line, you can't use excavators, you can't use any heavy equipment, especially in the times of artillery dominance, drone surveillance, and FPV drones. The most likely fortification line then was going here from Ocheretine down this road here, and then following the water and the ridge line here. And we even have a number of satellite pictures. For instance, we can see this here. This is a position, and those positions are actually still from the time before the full invasion, as this was still fairly close to the front line. As you can see, this was held by the Russians until February 24th of 2022. So the positions here were still basically in artillery range, which is the reason why we see those positions here. Here you can clearly see the positions for either artillery pieces or for heavy equipment, with a fortifications completely around it. And the position here is, as you can see, it's west of Ocheretine. We have further positions again with positions for vehicles or for artillery west of Novopokrovsk. To have the overall, this is here, east of that waterway. Then we have this here again, fortifications all around with some connecting trenches, command posts, and other positions for heavy weaponry. This is now down here along the waterway. This is the most likely fortification line. More positions like this. All of this is visible on Google Maps. So those are positions that are older, that haven't been built in the last month or two. All of those are dating back to the time before the full-scale invasion, but they are very likely the basis upon which the Ukrainians are now basing their fortification line. Here again, this is now going down here, the line towards the waterways. Here is Novobakhmutivka, and the position here at Ocheretine, so where we expect the Ukrainians to go down here. We have further fortifications again, you can see it going all around. Again, positions to drive in for heavy weaponry, and this is again directly here at the waterway. This here, a smaller position to some degree, but trenches this way, dugouts for heavy weaponry. And actually it's not that small. You see direct positions directly even at the water, and going towards here, going down till here. So in total we have an extension of this one position that is almost a kilometer long, this single fortification line that is being built here. We have further ones. This is, as you can see, even further to the west, but following that waterway here and the settlements. We also see various trench lines, positions for heavy weaponry here again, and smaller ones have been established prior to that as well. And this is, as you can see, east of those waterways. Here, for instance, were positions, and the Russians are now here. So we see them having pre-prepared positions. But again, this is not what they are having right now. The Ukrainians are building a second line of fortification, and what we can expect is them using this as a basis for further defense by having the positions along here. One was roughly here. One was I think it was down here. So you have the what we should expect the Ukrainians to take up as a position, as a new strong line of defense once this has fallen, is a line roughly like here, where they can base their defense on a much stronger fortification system that has since been improved. So while this initial line here, which was meant to hold back the Russians gaining time for these fortification lines, while this line is currently in the process of falling, how long they will be able to hold out, it's impossible to say, but we see that the Russians have penetrated this line already. The bigger, the stronger fortification line will be roughly 5-6 kilometers behind it, which again gives them better preparation, better time, and allows them to use heavier weapons, heavier equipment to build up those fortifications. That's where we are going to see the Ukrainians stopping the Russians a little longer, at least if that plan is going to work. This is what we should expect. So the fall of those two towns was to be expected. And as I said, roughly 1.5 months ago in the situation report, this is something where we should expect them to delay them for longer to gain time for an additional line of fortification. And this line is here, and it's probably fairly well built, at least if the Ukrainians have used the time as good as they can. A Ukrainian analyst at the same time is expecting fresh waves of the attacks towards Kupiansk and Liman. This is one of the likely advances of the likely aims of the Russians once their second phase, if you want it, or once their new offensive starts off. Right now we are still in the Rasputitsa, in the mud season, so using fields isn't as easy. Sometimes it even freezes over, but it's fairly muddy on the ground. Once it dries out, the significant attacks are to be expected. Obviously, Liman will open up a route towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, and from Kupiansk they can advance towards Izium together with Liman, which will be necessary to increase the pressure towards Kharkiv. So this is one of the main goals, and we are still having some Luhansk Oblast region held by the Ukrainians, which is obviously an important goal for the Russians as well, to capture the complete Luhansk Oblast, which they have annexed. The Ukrainian problems are continuing, though. We have a Politico article here writing, as said, great risks of the front lines collapsing. It doesn't seem that likely to me, as we see attempts by the Ukrainians to stabilize the front line, but they are still, even if we accept that the front line is probably not going to collapse, even though that might be wishful thinking, but I don't think, though, that it's going to collapse, though. He still mentions serious problems. Just to quote it here, Salushny used to call it the war of one chance once one of the officers said. By that he meant weapon systems become redundant very quickly because they are quickly countered by the Russians. For example, we use Storm Shadow and Scalp cruise missiles supplied by Britain and France successfully, but just for a short time. The Russians are always studying. They don't give us a second chance, and they are successful as this. This is important too, as there are tons of commenters outside who still claim the Russians are inept, can't do anything, are incompetent, while the real experts, be it foreign generals like Mick Ryan, the retired Australian general, Australian I think he is, yes, be it the Ukrainians themselves, they take the Russians serious. And here we have another example that they do adapt, that they are capable of learning, and that this means the better Western equipment really fast loses its edge over the Russians, and they can adjust to a lot of it. It also shows the problems that that Ukraine faces with these small deliveries and deliveries that are being announced a year before they even happen. Be it ground-launched small diameter bomb, which seems to have allowed the Russians to develop their own one. That might have been a problem that was in existence before, but the moment it was announced, it took over a year for Ukraine to receive the first ones, and in the meantime, the Russians have developed their own versions for it. It also means that after announcing that they are going to receive Challengers, Challenger 2, Abrams, and Leopard, the Russians had more than enough time to prepare for stronger and more modern Western MBTs, to adjust their tactics, to fight them, to counter them successfully, and we have to say they were successful in this. By giving them small amounts of equipment, for instance, with the Scalp and the Storm Shadow, a small batch allows the Russian to study the system and not suffer tremendous damage, while the weapon still has the edge over the Russian defense. And when the next batch comes, or maybe the batch after that, the Russian air defense has adjusted and the success rate of those cruise missiles is falling apart. This is a problem that Ukraine faces, and that is being mentioned here, and that we talked about a couple of times in the past. A clear fault by the West to be hesitant when it comes to aid, and not to deliver concentrated aid in a very short time. Other things are that the Russians are increasing their usage of mechanized attacks again. Not only at Tonenke, where we talked about that the Russians had suffered significant losses when they advanced here. They also attacked at Berdichi in platoon size attack, but they also attacked at Kremina recently in platoon size and in Chasiv Yar at a company size attack. So we see several bigger mechanized attacks by the Russians within just a few days, showing that the Russians have been able to replenish their losses to a degree where they feel confident again that they are able to suffer losses for the benefit of additional gains on their side. Ukraine also says that the Russians continue using chemical weapons and are increasing their usage of chemical weapons. Now, those are riot control agents, basically CS gas or CS gas, something like this. So while this is not by itself immediately lethal, it is in competition with oxygen and thus can make people suffocate from it. The issue is, though, while this might not be a directly lethal agent, it's still against the Convention Against Chemical Weapons, the Chemical Weapons Convention, which is signed and ratified by Russia, which explicitly also bans riot control agents in wartime use, and Russia still does it, and there are even videos from the Russians proving that they did it. And on the from the Czech Republic, we are hearing that the Russians have done thousands of cyber attacks against the Czech train system, and this is just the Czech train system to obviously prevent weapon deliveries and to cause bigger chaos inside of NATO. This is an ongoing offensive from hacker groups based in Russia to assist the Russian offensive, the Russian aggression against Ukraine. In troop generation terms, we have some numbers by the GUR. The Ukrainian military intelligence is talking about the Russian Air Force, obviously interesting in connection to the attacks against the airfields. There, the GUR says the Russians right now have roughly 100 Sukhoi 35, over 100 Sukhoi 34 and 7 A-50 ready for combat use. The stockpiles, the nominal stockpiles are bigger, but those are the numbers that are more or less ready for operational use. According to the Ukrainians, the Russians are also modernizing and repairing 3 additional A-50. Those are the Russian AVACs, basically. 2 of them are actually being worked on here in Taganrog, so the Ukrainians might, with a successful drone attack, actually have a word in the usage of those planes, but so far the drone attacks have not had the desired effect. Then we have a Russian opposition media saying that a NATO a NATO representative told them that NATO right now cannot see any Russian preparation for an additional wave of mobilization. In the last situation report, I told you that Zelensky said that the Ukraine is expecting 300,000 in additional mobilization by the Russians, and that actually doesn't seem to be completely likely. Now, there's always a possibility that the Russians act differently, but we just now have the next wave of conscription. This will fill up the Russian training grounds. This will take up a lot of Russian trainers that can't train mobilized personnel. And at the same time, while the Russian war production is going well, at least comparatively well, and while it's going far better than Ukraine, Russia still is far away from filling out its unit, so it needs additional units. Mobilizing several 100,000 additionally, when mostly you can only equip them with assault rifles and uniforms, is probably not the best thing, while at the same time even the Ukrainians agree that the Russians managed to fill their necessary recruitment goals with their current recruitment campaigns. So the Russians do not have an urgent personnel demand. They do not have the equipment to fill out tons of new units that are more than paper units. So if you have a mechanized brigade with 5 IFVs, that's not a mechanized brigade, that's mostly a rifle brigade. If they don't want to change that, if they don't want to create units that only exist where the heavy equipment or the doctrinal equipment only exists on paper, mobilization doesn't make too much sense. So in this context, I would not expect a mobilization coming in June, as Zelensky said it, and the NATO spokesperson here said more or less the same to the Ukrainian opposition media. Well, at the same time, the Russian Ministry of Defense is also saying that its recruitment efforts are very successful right now because of the Crocus terrorist attack. Russia is attributing it to Ukraine and uses it for recruiting additional personnel. This is, according to the Russians, this is highly successful, and we had to expect that the Russian government will try to use it for its own gain, and this is one of the signs how successful they might be with it. And it seems somewhat likely, as you can think, big terrorist attacks in your own country probably had some mobilization effect as well. If this at the time of war is happening and the supposed culprit is the opponent, the enemy in the war, then this should drive some recruitment efforts. The Russians also have started using FPV drones from ships as an attempt, as a means of fighting Ukrainian naval drones. Now, while this one started obviously from the ocean, from the shore, we see the usage where it scans and here finds a remotely controlled boat to then attack it and smash into it as a means of defending against. If they're spotted early enough, that should probably work, but if they're spotted early enough, there are other means to defend against it as well. So whether that's the smart move, we will have to see. Troop generation from Ukraine, we have some news as well. Ukraine wants to introduce new suicide drones, new attack drones with a range of 2,500 kilometers this year. This is basically beyond the Urals. According to calculations, the number of installations that can be hit with 2,500 kilometers of range will be 77 out of 99 of the biggest Russian air bases. And obviously everything more or less in range of Ukraine can be struck with those then. And most of the defense industry will also be in range. For instance, Ural-Vagonzavod might right now be out of reach, but with drones of that range, it will no longer be out of reach for Ukraine. The big question will obviously be how many of those can they produce, and will they manage to oversaturate the Russian defenses to strike, for instance, Ural-Vagonzavod and hinder the production. But we will have to see about this as well. And if you don't want to miss it, then obviously I would like to invite you to subscribe to this channel. In the political sphere, we have news that Finland and Ukraine have signed a 10-year security agreement, which will include additional help for Ukraine. But the important thing with all those security agreements is we're not talking about military aid in regards that any of those countries signing it with Ukraine is actually going to come to Ukraine's aid with its own military simply by effect of this treaty. And the Kremlin spokesperson Peskov has said that NATO and Russia are now in direct confrontation. This is basically in line what Dmitry Trenin said here in Russia Today, in the Russian propaganda outlet. He's a member of the Council for Foreign and Defense Policy in Russia, and he is insisting that Russia has moved away from the West and is looking actively for an alternative arrangement. As we can see here, while China still seeks to improve its position in the existing world order, Russia sees that the state of affairs as being beyond repair and is instead seeking to prepare for a new alternative arrangement. I've mentioned this already in my video about the battle for Kiev 2022, how this single battle has been such a pivotal event for probably this whole century, but by a simple battle changing world history, both for Ukraine as well as for Europe, as probably for the world. I mentioned this point as well in this video, so if you have missed it so far, I'll link it to you up here in the description, in the info box. And we have Transnistria saying that a drone hitting a military unit, but a military unit in Transnistria, that's the separatist region here in Moldova that is occupied by Russian soldiers and pro-Russian separatists. While this military unit has, according to the Transnistrians, been attacked, the damage has been light and there were no casualties on their side. They didn't accuse Ukraine directly, but mention how close the base was to the Ukrainian border, obviously pointing a finger regardless. In international support, we also have some news. Finland is giving Ukraine a new package of 188 million euros in military aid. And Lithuania has published that they handed over M577 armored vehicles. Those are basically command versions of the M113, which is already in Ukrainian use and will obviously be helpful to the Ukrainian armed forces. Then finally, we have some weird pictures here. We see a Russian tank being filled with electronic warfare devices, and supposedly somewhere there's even a generator to power all of this. As you can see here, how it is being basically bolted on top of it. And according to the reports, this was actually fairly successful, and a lot of drones were failing to succeed. This tank was supposedly supporting a group of other tanks that he guarded with his electronic warfare shield, but as you can see, it was still able to take pictures of this, as it was finally taken out regardless with an FPV drone after all. But we see Russian attempts to be successful with their electronic warfare. In today's situation report, we're going to finish with a positive note. Now, this is a story coming out of Ukraine, whereas this boy here, I'll do it twice the speed, so it won't take that long, where this boy was always running outside with a Ukrainian flag when the helicopters of the armed forces were passing by. And in this case, they have decided to actually land, and supposedly that's the explanation that was given, that they gave him a package of sweets to thank him for his support. And we can see him running away here, whereas one of the Ukrainian Hind attack helicopters has landed. We see one of the pilots running here from the landed helicopter, while the other one is circling around, and you can see it's also a Mi-24 Hind, and he's coming back to fly back. Some nice human gesture by both sides, the support for the armed forces, as well as obviously the beautiful event for that child that probably didn't expect something like this, and I think that's a nice way to end today's situation report. If you like this, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment. What do you think about the current situation, and do you have anything to add? And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. I try my best to be as objective as I can. While I clearly denounce the Russian aggression against the Ukrainian side, I do not see a point in running a propaganda channel that just gives good news, even if there barely are any. I think a sober view on the current situation is valuable and is needed, and that's how I run the channel, even though a propaganda channel would probably be far more successful. But if you appreciate it, then I would really enjoy your support and your subscriptions. And speaking about support, this channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting this channel, and that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.